Okay, hello and welcome to Standard 2 of the Oklahoma State Department of Education curriculum and review of the lessons and materials that are provided to teach personal financial literacy. We get to visit with Sue Lynn Sasser, Dr. Sasser. Today, she is a huge part of personal finance education in our state. As a champion of personal finance education, was a big leader in getting this mandate passed and also continuing to try and improve and help make it better for teachers teaching it in our state and of course our students who are learning it. So Dr. Sasser has also been a significant part of the curriculum and the writing and editing of it. And so we get to visit with her today about Standard 2 and what's in those resources. Before we even get started though, Dr. Sasser, I wanted to ask you, taxes is such a big part of education. It falls in almost every grade level. What do you think is one of the most important things that teachers should know when they're talking to students about taxes?
Well, I think as a taxpayer, we kind of despise having to pay taxes, but, we also have to talk about what are the many benefits that we receive. I mean, there's always a delicate balance between how much should we pay and, how much should the government do versus the individual or the private sector. But the reality is, even in a market-based system, you do have a role of government, and you've got to have money to support that role of government, and that is supported by taxes. And it doesn't matter whether it's an income tax, a sales tax, or a property tax, or any other kind of tax. It still all comes from tax dollars to support what the government does, and of course, that's things like education and a variety of other things. I mean, look at our military, look at our roads and our highways, and any kind of public safety that we have. All comes from taxes, and so sometimes I think we look at how much it costs, but we don't always stop and look at the benefits that we receive from those tax dollars. And sometimes I think people feel like they pay and pay and pay and don't have any benefits, but just get out and drive your car. And there would be no roads, there would be no public safety, there would be nothing out there if we didn't have a role of government, because the government is building those roads. One of the things I used to say in class was, suppose your house was on fire and you had to call and negotiate a price. you know that's not a position any of us want to be in, and so again, just having those basic services is important to individuals, and it's also important to business, because business couldn't function without taxes either.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much. That is so important to think about all those principles in taxes. I Before we get started in jumping into those resources, one thing that we both wanted to update the viewers of this video is that we will get to have the opportunity to update these resources in the next coming school year, academic year, which will be the 21-22 school year. So in the near future, this standard will be updated, and we'll of course update this part of the program on Edge and within the State Department of Education. And so be on the lookout for this. If you're watching this, it'll be soon be some updates that you'll want to see and look at. So,
And I think I'm kind of excited about being able to go back in and strengthen some of these lessons that we've been able to do. We have made some changes to keep them current, but we haven't been able to go back in and add a little bit more rigor to the lessons. And that's something that I look at us doing as a cooperatively here in the next year.
excellent. Okay, very good. Well, we'll go and get started. Sulin, do you want me to bring up the teacher lesson
Sure,
or?
we can look
Okay.
at the teacher lesson, teacher's guide. One of the things that people should note that we created PowerPoints for each of the lessons, and those are separate. Those are individual. I mean, lesson one would have its own PowerPoint, lesson two would have its own PowerPoint. But for the teacher's guide, we lumped everything together. And so, we start off with the standards for this the objectives for this standard, then we also go in and break down and look at the individual objectives for each lesson. And so, but that's all together, as well as all the additional activities, any of the enhancement activities or ideas for extending the lesson. All of those are built into to one teacher's guide to try to make it a little bit easier for teachers. And while it's always been our goal to make each lesson standalone, I think it's kind of difficult at times to say this lesson only covers X, because if you've looked at standard one, in standard one, there's lesson 3 that talks about some things to do with income tax. And so you're going to see as you go through a little bit of carryover from one lesson to another, but that's because we try to teach things at the teachable moment. I mean, where is it that it makes the most sense to make sure that we're covering everything, and just to make sure that the concepts are relatable to students, because we could create some great lessons, but that doesn't mean that they would really be relatable or fun, even fun to teach. So this one, again, we come back and we try to look at the different types of taxes that are paid, the services they provide. We go in and look at types of taxes. We get a little bit into the some of the economic theory, if you will, behind taxes. The whole idea of being a progressive tax versus a regressive tax, who should pay and who has the ability to pay versus the benefits received. And then we've got, of course, what people view as free riders, or economists view as free riders, people that can drive through our community but yet never pay anything for our roads and highways. But just the whole concept then of taxes, and again, and why they're important, and important for individuals as well as for society in general. So that really gets us into looking at the specifics that go behind standard 2. And here we're moving on in to look at some of the objectives of lesson 1. And so what we've tried to do is, again, identify what the key terms are. And one of the things that we've done with these PowerPoints and is we've moved the definitions to the end of every PowerPoint, because we know that teachers don't always want to cover that right at the beginning. So, but we still want you to have access to those definitions. And we're trying to use common definitions that are included in the vast majority of the Council for Economic Education's lessons, because we see a lot of carryover from those lessons. And again, we're just trying to standardize what a definition is. And I think when I taught, and I've been retired now for a couple of years, but when I taught, and even then when I went back to teach as an adjunct, one of the things I stressed with people is understanding what words mean. Words have very specific meanings. And if you understand what those words mean, it makes it so much easier to understand the concept. And so if we can help students understand what is exactly a progressive tax, how is that different from a regressive tax, then they start to understand, again, the whole concept of taxing and how you put those two together to try to build that concept of, I'll put quotation marks, fairness into the tax system. And so, again, coming back to looking at this lesson, we identify what your the exact objectives for this lesson. We look at the definitions, and then we start to move on into the procedures. And here we've got, this poor little kid that goes in wanting to buy things, and he looks at it and then realize he has to pay tax for it. And I can remember taking my grandkids in, and I say, here's $10, you've got $10 to spend, and they want to buy something that's $9.99. I'm like, no, that's not going to work. So, there's so many little things like that we don't stop and think about when it comes to taxes, that they're going to add those sales tax on. if you used any of the PowerPoints from the previous round, I think we have made the PowerPoints much stronger to fit the lesson. And we've tried to add more to those PowerPoints so that you almost could teach the lesson without the students reading it. However, I still think it's important for students to be able to read a lesson and have that copy available to them, even if you just send them online to look and read the lesson at night or as part of their, pull your phone out uh, and read that lesson. I still think it's critically important that they read and get all the background that goes in behind it. And that is something even that teachers might want to do to kind of flesh out the procedures that are there in the teacher's guide. So we can scroll on down, Amy, and Amy asked me if I wanted to have control of this, and I said no, I always mess it up. So I'm just going to be honest,
Glad to be here to do that.
So Amy does a great job. We do a lot of presentations together, and she always does a great job at keeping up with it. So one of the things that we try to do with each of the lessons is we come back and provide a summary of that lesson, because it is important to come back and summarize. And then we try to have some questions at the end as part of that review. And then whatever the opening scenario is, we want to come back and close the loop on that. Each of the lessons also have some type of an activity guide, some type of an assessment. And most of those are going to look like very traditional assessments, because these lessons from Standard 2 forward only have the traditional classroom setting. As we go back and edit lessons, we will add more for a flipped environment and more for a virtual environment. But because we're not really editing these lessons, we're just kind of doing a very quick update and putting them in a new format. We didn't add a whole lot to enhance these lessons, as Amy mentioned early on. But we have tried to add a couple of alternative assessments. So even if you don't like just the traditional of, here's 5 questions, answer those, you have some different things that you can do with students. And I think looking at, alternative assessments is always good. Kids get tired of just answering, multiple choice questions. And I think having them really apply the concepts is where learning truly takes place. And so we do really try to look at some of that application in each of the lessons. And so that kind of takes us then through lesson 1. And as we move on into lesson 2, we get into a little bit more of that concept of voluntary compliance, in the fact that we have, as citizens of this country, we have a moral and ethical obligation to pay taxes to support the system. And so we look at what are those moral and ethical reasons for paying taxes. And we also look at, what happens if you fail to do that, if you fail to abide by the law, because there are consequences for people that don't pay taxes. And I appreciate people having religious freedom, but that religious freedom is still supported by a court system that is provided by tax dollars. And so we still have to have some way to try to pay for that freedom that we have, and protection of that freedom that we have. So this lesson gets more into looking a little bit more at the philosophical side, perhaps, of taxes, as we get into, again, things like ethics and so forth. So we can scroll on down through that a little bit, Amy. The morals, the quality of life or standard of living, and this starts to look at that social side of taxes. Why do we pay those, and what is the benefit that we as individuals and we as communities, we as business, we as a society in general, what is the benefit that we have from paying taxes? The vast majority of our taxes are based on our own voluntary compliance. We agree to do it. We agree to report what we have actually earned. Now, there are reports that go into the government with some of the tax forms that we get. And so we know that, some of that's reported for us, but there's a lot of it that is not reported for us. And so we have an obligation to be honest with what it is, rather than trying to hide taxes. And there was a study that was done a few years ago, and it showed that we all could have a reduction of about 15% in our taxes if everybody actually paid what they owed. So that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. So when you cheat on your taxes, you're cheating society. But that means that some of us we're all paying more. Those of us that pay. So it's a little bit different approach. But then in economics, which is what I taught the vast majority of time, you get into those issues, which again are to get into student discussion and have them think about why we do some of the things that we do. So again, we can scroll on down. Notice that we try to identify the slides that you want to use for the different discussion points. These are not as detailed as perhaps you would find with standard one, because again, we know we're going to come back and revisit this in the near future, very near future for this standard. So if we want to scroll on down, one of the things that, and I'm not sure where it is, I think in this lesson, it's part of the activity, in which we don't have the activities are in the student lessons, and so they're not going to be reflected here. But the voluntary compliance activity, 2.2b, I think that's the one that has quotes. And I love using quotes because quotes are a way to get students to see something through somebody else's eyes, and then come back and talk about why are they saying it this way. Then how can you take that quote and put that into your own words? Do you agree or disagree with that quote? So it really is a great way to get students involved. Yeah.
I was trying to, I didn't mean for it to actually pull
That's
up, but
okay.
there it
Yeah.
is.
See, that's why Amy can do this kind of stuff, and I can, as my dad used to say, pontificate. So again, we can stop here, and here you see, the old traditional way of doing the assessment, and we're going to leave that in there because there's teachers like to do that, and there's also times that works great. And so we're going to leave those traditional assessments in there, but you can scroll on down now, Amy. Thanks. It's the civic duties and taxes activity. And notice we just give a series of quotes and let students respond to those. You can put them in groups to do that. You can let them do that as an individual activity. But coming back and discussing this as a class, I mean, what a great way to get kids involved. They're not having to share, basically, come up with an idea. All they're having to do is respond to something that somebody else has said. Now, we do in this activity where students have to write their own quote, but again, that's a good way for them to kind of summarize what it is they have learned from the entire discussion, or what it is they have learned from the lesson. And so we have write a quote in the space that your views on civic responsibility. And so that's actually in that one and not in the last one, which can roll on down, that looks at voluntary compliance. Again, if you would rather take and use some of these activities as the assessment, go for it, because we're just trying to give you a variety of things that you can use that fit your teaching, but most importantly, fit your students, because each environment is so very different. One point that I want to make about this, and we can go back to the teacher's guide, is in these guides, we do have ways to enhance the lesson. And one of the enhancements for this lesson looks at having students complete a 1040. I mean, that's a great activity, but just completing a form is not all that we want students to learn. We want students to truly understand taxes, why they're paying, what the different types of taxes are, and how it impacts them and how it impacts society in general. And you can't get that from completing a form. And so that's why we moved that to more of an extension of the lesson rather than it being the heart and soul of the lesson. And if you look a lot of other curriculums, when you start talking about taxes, that's the first thing they're going to show you. So here's how you fill out a 1040. Well, a couple of years ago, the government totally changed that 1040. Now, I will say this, we have our activity in there, but I can also know that if you go to Econ EdLink, which we list as one of the resources, they've also got activities for how to complete those 1040s. The activity that was there, yeah, here we move into completing the form. We give you different scenarios to complete those forms. There's another activity that is there just to help students kind of understand taxes. And then we get into assessing. And if you wanted to take some of these, excuse me, not assessing, but extending. But if you wanted to have students identify a state or a city where they want to live and explore the taxes, that's a great assessment activity that you could take and use, because anything that applies the concepts that are taught in the lesson is a great way to assess their learning. The IRS does have a series of videos that are out, and so you can go to their YouTube channel. I think that's the correct word, that wording that we use. But you can go to the IRS channel on YouTube and find some of them are older, but the vast majority of them are still very, very good. And then again, I'll mention the Econ EdLink, because I know there's several lessons there that stay current to look at how to complete tax forms and other aspects of taxes. I was kind of thinking too, sometimes going back to your initial question, Amy, sometimes I think just having kids write down what are all the things in your community that are supported by taxes. I think it might be kind of earth shattering or earth shaking. Maybe that's the word to use, to think about all the things that we have that are supported by taxes. And I mean, I'm not crazy about paying that tax bill every month or every time you get a paycheck. I mean, it hurts. But again, you've got to come back and look at what are the benefits? What are we receiving from that? And now I guess as a Social Security recipient, I think a little bit more about some of those things too. But I mean, the vast majority of my career was in public education, and I mean, it just provides so much for our individuals and for our society that we just can't discount how important they are. Again, where's the balance? How much should it be? That's debatable. But whether or not we should pay, I have a problem saying that's debatable.
Very
But yeah,
good.
again, everything that we try to do in these lessons is based on that cost and benefits. Because every time we make a choice, there's something else that's happening. There's some kind of reaction to it. And so, what are those costs and what are those benefits? Is that
Excellent. Okay. Anything else you want to add, Sue Lynn?
I don't think so. Again, our goal is to really just help kids understand taxes, not any one particular tax, and just really understand how the whole system fits together, because it takes taxes from all different sources to support different things that really make the system come together.
Mhm. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sasser. I really appreciate your time and walking us through Standard 2. And we thank everybody for joining us. And of course, let us know if you have any questions about teaching Standard 2.